Awesome. So,
Cool.
Will, I'm so glad you're able to join me today.
Very, very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Um, so it seems like you've been pretty busy despite the pandemic. I know, and I don't know when you recorded it, but with the Amazon film Bliss just coming out that you scored. So that's pretty exciting stuff.
Yeah, I was kind of fortunate that a few projects were halfway through. I mean, it's sort of good and bad, I guess. But yeah, the pandemic, I was able to kind of keep going when a lot of things were shutting down. So I'm very fortunate in that sense.
So did the pandemic interfere with a lot of your actual recording of music, or was a lot of that in the box? Or as I can see behind you, you've got a heck of a lot of synths and instruments already there at home.
Yeah, well, between the studio and my studio in North Hollywood, I do have a lot of toys and a lot of stuff that I've collected over the years. But it's funny. I feel like one of the reasons why I've moved around quite a lot. I mean, I grew up in London and then I lived in New York for 15 years, and now I'm in LA and I've been here for about 5 years. And I found that a lot of the people that I collaborate with or have record on some of my projects tend to be not in the same city. So, for example, I use a strings guy called Lev Zerbin a lot, and we've got into this habit of like I'll write something with MIDI and then like email him a PDF of the chart, and then he'll kind of record in his apartment and send it back to me. So there's a few other musicians that I work that way with, and I've been doing that for about a decade. So in some ways, there are certain aspects of my process that haven't really been altered by COVID at all. And then, of course, there are other things that are just completely derailed, like spotting sessions and, mix stages and, orchestral records and stuff like that. But I think that we composers generally are pretty adaptable and able to sort of make good of certain situations. And, yeah, the remote recording thing was not that new to me, put it that way. So
Yeah, I was gonna say it sounds like you're accidentally pandemic proofed yourself in
yeah,
some ways.
maybe. Yeah, totally. But yeah, I think that's just because of, not being in the same city for that long. The people that I've kind of grown up with are already all over the place. So it's kind of
So how have you? I mean, how have you developed that network of other artists, composers, musicians? Has that just been kind of a product of working in music for so long?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, my background is a bit all over the place. I started out as a jazz musician, then I discovered techno and electronic music, released some records in England, and then I started a indie band that I was the lead singer of in New York. We did that for nearly a decade. And I guess like along the way, I've just been in bands, done kind of live performances, composed for various projects. And I think naturally, after so many years in this game, you just kind of you start to amass a family. And there are people that I have been doing stuff with for years. And I'm very lucky to still be able to work with a lot of them. And, the more you work with people, the more you develop that shorthand. And I think that's really important to kind of have that sort of flexibility and that familiarity with people.
Yeah, I bet. Well, and especially if you're going through that many genres as well. It's one thing if you're just sticking in kind of the classical pigeonhole, then you're still gonna, I'm sure, run into so many musicians. But I mean, doing that, jazz, techno, I mean, indie rock even.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's all over the place. So, like the best man of my wedding is this guy called Quentin Collins, and we grew up as we shared a flat together when we were 19. He's a trumpet player, I was a sax player. We thought we were like Bird and Dizzy. And he continued to be, he's now one of London's premier trumpet players. He's a total badass. And I obviously kind of took a bit of a different path, but like we've continued to work together. We wrote some cues together for Bliss. He's featured on that score, and we've done a bunch of stuff. I'll like find any excuse to fly him to LA and just like have a messy time in the studio and have some fun and make some music together. So yeah, it's really a blessing to be able to work in a field where you can just hang out with your mates, and make a living from
Yeah, I
it.
bet. I don't know. At least I'm jealous, and I'm sure other people listening in will be too.
Yeah,
So how
there are
did you with?
good and bad sides.
Yeah, I bet. Um, with that winding path to get to where you are now, I mean, was film and other media compositions something that was always in your mind, or did you just kind of stumble into it?
I think that I think film music was weirdly like the gateway for me to really fall in love with music in general. The story I always tell is when I was 5 or 6 years old, I sang the whole score of Star Wars to my parents, and then they went out and bought me a violin that I was terrible at, but like I tried to persevere with it for 4 or 5 years, and then discovered the sax. But I think that relationship between music and film was kind of the thing that really birthed the love of music and the power that it has. And of course, at that age, I didn't really understand that at the time. But, you know, when I discovered that there was this guy called John Williams who was responsible for all of these pieces of music that I loved so much, I think I was maybe 7 or 8 by the time I realized that it was just one dude. It was like, whoa, like, how is that possible? How can someone create all those melodies? And I just fell in love with this idea of film scoring. And then, you know, like the first record I bought was Ennio Morricone's The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I just have always loved things that are kind of colorful and a bit weird. And, you know, then I discovered jazz and, like I said, dance music and all of that stuff. So I feel like I've taken a lot of weird turns and been sort of distracted by, you know, like the Rinse, the band that I was in, desperately trying to get signed for 10 years and banging our heads against walls and dodging success like ninjas for a decade. And then, you know, but all of that stuff kind of fuels your background and has made me a better musician, I think. But it definitely took me off the course a little bit. But having said that, the only way that I ever knew how to make a living, I've had one proper job that I got when I was 20. I worked at the Savoy Tailors Guild, selling suits. So I got fired because I didn't know how to fold clothes very well. But other than that, I've managed to kind of feed myself by scoring, and that's partly because I rather naively thought that scoring commercials would be a route into film scoring. So I started doing that in my early 20s and got quite good at it, and was the in-house composer for a few different music houses, and eventually went off and started my own. But you know, that was another training ground for me, you know, learning to write quickly and learning to write in tons of different genres and stuff. So yeah, it's kind of always been, I think music and film has just always been that natural pairing for me. It wasn't like a late discovery. It's always been there.
So that is interesting that it's always been there for you. It just may have taken a while for you to land right into it.
Yeah, I think I just I didn't take the idea very seriously at first of like I didn't think it was possible to be a film composer. I thought I did a music degree, but it wasn't like a reading and writing kind of music degree. It was at the University of Westminster. It's called commercial music, weirdly, and it was like a bit of engineering, bit of business, bit of performance, bit of everything. But I think I grew up in that sort of pre DAW world where we all thought that to be a film composer you needed to be like have a conservatoire education and that kind of thing. You know what I mean? Like the school that I went to, it was somewhat frowned upon to try to do music without being very academic. And I think that's really changed lately. But you know, I'm a kid of the 80s and 90s, and in my day it was like I was told to go out and get a proper job, you know. Like my school told me not to pursue music. They said it was too risky.
That
I
seems
know,
like
it's
a
crazy.
weird thing to be told from a music school.
Yeah, I'm talking about high school.
Okay.
Yeah, when I was I remember my music teachers at my high school they were not particularly encouraging and supportive of the idea of trying to do this for a living. And maybe rightly so, because it's risky and it's hard and all of that. And funnily enough, I ended up going to university to do a French degree because I thought that would be like a better, more academic. It's so stupid. I lost it a year because I was like a gigging jazz musician at the time and was like performing in clubs and bars and then trying to squeeze in a French education at the same time. It just wasn't going to work. So I left that and did a music degree instead. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. My father was an actor and he had that similar sort of thing where it was like, oh, don't do what I do. Go out and be a plumber plumber, be something useful. Don't don't get into the arts. It's too difficult. So I don't know.
You know, it's actually funny that you say that, especially about him being an actor, because I was reading an article earlier today about Sebastian Stan, who plays the Winter Soldier in the Marvel films, and
Oh,
how
sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
he was like homeless up until Captain America came out. And I know Renner, I think, was like living out of his car until the Hurt Locker became a
Right.
big film. And yeah, so it's weird. You think of these like lavish lifestyles, and even for film composers, you see like the composer studio walkthroughs for someone like Hans Zimmer, and it's like, whoa, this is like big money. And then it's like, well, no, that's the top
Yeah, and
0.01% of people.
it doesn't happen straight away. I don't really know
Yeah.
his story, but I'm sure he has a similar kind of path where, you start out just kind of scraping by. And, my dad did all right, but we still kind of grew up going into the dole queue every like 6 months. He'd
Mm.
be out of work, and that would be like part of our background, going like queuing up with him to get his check. So, but then he'd get a job in the West End, and he'd be all right for 3 or 4 months. And I think that as a parent, you sort of sometimes don't want to like inflict that on your children. Maybe I'm a dad now as well, and I'm like, yeah, I mean, I'd be really proud of my kids if they got into this racket, but at the same time, it's really hard. It's just very, it's unpredictable, I guess. That's it. And if you've got the stomach for it, then give it a crack. But otherwise, yeah, get a proper job. Yeah.
Well, good. That'll be the takeaway for any
Totally.
yeah,
Yeah.
anyone in school who's thinking about being a composer. No, get a proper job.
Well, I say that with a pinch of salt.
Oh, I know. So you said something a few minutes ago that caught my attention, where you mentioned that you were interested in and got into scoring for commercials, naively thinking that would be a gateway into film scoring. And I
Right.
don't know if I've really talked with anyone about scoring for commercials. So could you expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess like the main thing for me was I thought like, oh, well, they're making this director obviously is going to make a commercial, and then he or she will go off and make a TV show or a movie, and maybe they'll bring me along too. And when I was writing as a composer in music houses, that's kind of how I thought I would make my connections. But in the end, that's sort of not really how it worked out. And I actually started my own company so that I could kind of create an environment where there would be that level of cross-pollination. And it's taken me a long time to develop the business to do that, but it wasn't a natural progression. But yeah, like scoring ads is kind of, I think I was straight out of college. I was 21. I worked at a company called B5 Atomic for a marvelous man called Heinhoven, who was living in England at the time. And I did like a Del Monte commercial and like all sorts of stuff. You'd get a brief in the morning, and it would be most of the time they'd need it the following day or that afternoon. I mean, it was crazy, so crazy. And at first I was just like, that's impossible. But after a while of doing that all the time, you just kind of get used to it. And I did it. I then moved to New York and worked at another company called Amber, and I was there for 12 years. No, wait, 7 years. And I had a studio in their building, and it was a really great training ground for me to sort of like, I already had quite a good background and quite varied sort of musical abilities in terms of instruments that I could play and just sort of an overall knowledge of stuff. But it was just, it can be a real grind. And I think it's one of those things that you've got to sort of maybe just do a little bit of if you're trying to get into scoring movies, because it can start to sort of, it starts to commodify the process a bit, like music as a commodity. It's not a completely natural thing to write that quickly and that extensively. And like sometimes they want 5 versions of a 30-second spot. So yeah, I started Fall on Your Sword as a way to sort of encourage that idea that maybe we could do a little bit of everything. And I was finding myself when I was at the other place, I I would do all the ads during the day, and then at night when my boss wasn't around, I would quickly do my little short film or like my tiny little indie movie that had no money on it, or like a friend's thing, and hope that eventually something good would happen. And sure enough, one of them ended up at Sundance, and that was kind of the beginning of my film career. But like none of that was really supported by that company, so I had to kind of do it on the sly, and it just seemed crazy. Like, I want to go somewhere where I can do all of this and it's really supported by the whole framework of the company. So that's sort of what I built, and it's worked out really well. And that's kind of, now I don't really do the ads anymore, but we have a little team of composers who take care of the commercials. I do, obviously I'm working on movies and TV and games more these days, so I don't really have that much time, although I get wheeled out of retirement every now and again to do the odd spot. But yeah, it's a great education. I think it's a bit of a different skill set though, to scoring something that's long form, you know, like understanding a character and a narrative and a larger story. It's not really the same bag of chips as scoring a 60-second commercial.
Right. You don't have a 30 you don't have a big thematic development over 30-second spot.
Yeah, but it's definitely, it's a good way to sharpen your tools, because even in television there's still a need to write relatively quickly. We get a little bit longer than on ads, but there's definitely that like fast turnaround that's required. You can't kind of sit around waiting for lightning to strike. You got to kind of get on with the job. So I think that ads helped me to learn that skill as well.
So with that just constant crunch and ad work, did you have any times where it got too much, or you had to get something done by the next day, and the next day rolls around and you're empty-handed, or you have something that isn't gonna work or isn't quite right?
I feel like you always get it done somehow. I don't know. It's ridiculous. I now have like the brutal reality as well of that world is that you can do, like, you got to kind of accept that 80% of what you write isn't going to go. It's not going to air. And I think in the end, for me, as a creative, artistic person, that was the thing that kind of killed it for me. I couldn't keep dealing with the idea that like, that there's that amount of rejection. You know what I mean? Like, God, am I going to work on this thing all night, knowing that it's just kind of a numbers game in the end, like, that there's 10 tracks coming from this company, there's probably 10 tracks coming from 3 other companies, there's like a 1 in 40 chance, let's say, you know what I mean? So I think that was kind of like, ooh, I don't want to, you start to kind of maybe not care as much. And that's when I decided that I really needed to stop doing it, because you want to always make your best work. But yeah, I think, you just somehow always get stuff done. But because of that, like 80-20 ratio, I have a vast library of stuff. And that was kind of why we started Fall on Your Sword as well, because we were sitting on this like library of work of mine that was like a way to begin the business. And it's different now. Obviously, we have like more stuff from other people, but we had a way to begin the company, which was really helpful. Me and Lucy Alper, who's my business partner. So yeah, that's another part of it, is that rejection that I don't think any of us get used to,
Yeah, well, and obviously with film scoring, there's always the possibility of rejection. Sometimes you get partway on and it doesn't work, but that seems like it's more so a creative difference versus having a 2% chance of someone wanting your stuff.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's something inherently more collaborative, about working on let's say you've got the job, you're working on the show or the movie, but you're finding the sound of something together with the director or producers. I think it's so much more healthy, and that's what I always wanted, was to be able to have that kind of collaborative feeling when you're making the music for this picture. And with commercials, there's none of that. It's like no or yes, it's like either right or wrong, and then maybe you can kind of get into like a revision process. But You know, there's never that sort of feeling of exploring that's more creative. There's just less time. I think that's all it is, really.
Interesting. And so then obviously you mentioned during that period you were moonlighting, doing short films, indie films, and
That's right.
it like in I mean obviously it's skill based but also kind of a luck of the draw that one of them happened to get a lot of attention, kind of kickstart things.
That's right. Yeah, I did a movie with a director called Rai Russo Young. We did a movie called You Won't Miss Me together, which was her first feature. And yeah, went to Sundance. Um, and honestly, things just kind of grew from there. It's amazing that you can kind of pinpoint it to one thing. It also was like my first real experience scoring a feature, and it was kind of like, ooh, I like this. This is a bit more like it. So yeah, that led to, I think the following year I had two movies at Sundance. The following year, three or four. It just kind of every year.
Mm.
Though I went through a phase of about 5 or 6 years where I just had a lot of those like smaller budget Sundance movies, and it was great. And to be introduced to that community just sort of changed everything for me, really.
Interesting. And some of this answer is going to be obvious of like obviously being at a bigger stage is going to change things, but what else being there kind of helped change things? I mean, was it just the like your name and you being exposed to a greater market, or kind of having that like more commercial critical success with things to get you out there?
Yeah, I think it's almost like a validation of
Mm.
like, oh, this is actually, I think I struggled to say that I was a composer before I started having movies at Sundance. You know what I mean? Like, what do you do for a living? I'm kind of a composer. I'm kind of in a band. You know, there's a bit of that going on for a long time for me. But I think once I had a couple of Sundance films, it was like, I'm a composer. I'm a film composer, and I got an agent out of Sundance, and it just sort of it validated that trajectory for me, and it also kind of, let's be honest, I think it kind of closed the door finally for me, like sleeping in the van and driving around America with my little band. It was like, okay, I think, well, we've had a good crack. Now I'm going to do this for a while. So yeah, it just sort of, it made me take it a bit more seriously, I think. I'm very grateful for it. Just, yeah, like I said, it took a lot longer than it probably should have.
And feel free not to answer because this might date you a little bit. But I mean, how long did it really take for you to go from working on commercials or maybe working from your first couple short films to feeling comfortable at Sundance, landing that agent, feeling like, all right, I'm a film composer?
That's a great question. God. It's I don't know if it's COVID, but it's also just like time is such a blur right now. I call it the,
Yeah.
the time salad because of that lost year. Um, let's see. I guess I moved to New York in 2002, and I moved to LA in 2015. And I think probably 2008 was maybe like the first time I was at Sundance. So what's that? Yeah, like 6 years. There was like 6 or 7 years of grinding away in New York that was really the time when I was really just trying. It probably took about that long. Yeah, 6 or 7 years. And, from there to start, it kind of all happened at once. Me becoming a film composer and me starting Fall on Your Sword as a company. Um, it was all part of the same decision, I guess, to kind of realign everything, not be like a staff writer at a music house, just try and do something a bit different. Yeah.
So then it was around that time, or maybe a little while afterward, that you, I think, first collaborated with Mike Cahill,
That's right.
who
Yeah.
directed Bliss.
Hmm.
And before we really get into that relationship and into Bliss, I was curious. I think in some of those earlier scores, at least on like Wikipedia and Spotify and stuff, Fall on Your Sword's listed as the as the composer rather than
Right.
you.
Yeah.
Was there anything conscious to that, or was it
There
just like a
was very much so. So I I almost feel like we kind of jumped the gun in terms of it. It was like a bit too early in the film scoring world to kind of try this, but I had this idea that I wanted it to be, Fall on Your Sword initially was a band.
Hmm.
And then kind of like a video art project. I had quite a lot of success with this this William Shatner video that was on YouTube, and we found ourselves I had to kind of form a band to play at these like sci-fi conventions and stuff like that because of the success of this video that went viral. And then that went on for a couple of years, and it just made sense to kind of just brand everything the same. I thought like, oh, well, what if I score movies, we've got the band and we've got the company, and we'll just all do it as one thing. And that was a very conscious decision.
Hmm.
And I think worked for the first couple of years. And then eventually I realized that I wanted to kind of be separated from it somehow. And like, not everyone loved the idea. Like, people were a bit confused by, were they hiring a band to score their movie, or was it just one person, or like what was going on there? And it was just, I found myself having to explain it to too many people. So eventually, I think maybe We Steal Secrets, I scored that movie under my own name, but then I released the album as Fall on Your Sword. And I think that was the last thing it was like the last effort of trying to sort of keep it as one thing. And eventually it just made sense to kind of separate it. So now we have like real estate as like Fall on Your Sword. The studios is also like an audio post-production facility, in North Hollywood. So it's easier now to kind of get your head around it. It's like a place and like a sort of an art collective, and we make art pieces and stuff like that too. But at the time when I was kind of trying to get momentum for my own career and for the company, it was like, I'm doing all this stuff, let's just make it all the same and see what happens. And and I think good things came from it, and also it baffled a few people too. But yeah, like I think I did a movie called Beneath, and that one I was listed as Fall on Your Sword, I think. Yeah. Maybe that was the last one, actually. But yeah, that's that. I don't know if that's baffled you, probably.
I mean, no, I wouldn't say it because I think there's some more modern parallels, like with remote control productions,
Yeah,
Hans Zimmer's group. There's
that's right.
it's not exactly the same, but I think there's a lot of similarity there where there are composers that have come out of it, and I think if they're working on something, that group is, whether in the forefront or kind of behind the scenes, is also involved in some ways. So, no, it makes sense, and I think it's even if it didn't completely work out the way you kind of intended. I don't know. I like when people try to do something a little different because if
Why not?
if
Yeah.
everyone did the same thing, the world would be really boring.
Yeah. I mean, like I said, I think it worked to an extent. I think ultimately the inherent difference between like Fall on Your Sword and say Remote Control is that we didn't begin as a facility with a
Mm,
strict path the way that Hans did. I mean, Fall on Your Sword, one of the first things we did was open for LCD Sound System, for example. We had a record on DFA, that you can't say that about Remote Control. So it's sort of like right there, that's weird and like
yeah.
confusing to people as well. So is it a place that I can go to, or are you going to play at my wedding? Like, what is it? um, so I think that the mistake was maybe trying to just umbrella it too much. I went from one extreme to the other, and
Mm,
like it would have been better for it to be the way it is now, which is that Foy's is kind of the facility, my team of composers that do the commercials and the weird art projects that we do, and that's kind of where it ends, and everything else is under my own name. It just makes more sense, I think.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. What are some of the art projects? Is it kind of sound for installations?
um it's kind of both, actually. We build the installation. So
Hmm.
we did a series of shows called the Spring Break Art Show, which is in New York City. It's at the same time as the Armory, which is like a big art week in New York. It's sort of New York's version of Basel, I guess. And we did these shows during the Armory at spring break. And the first one we did was in 2012, and it was a apocalypse themed art show. And we built a piano that when you hit keys on the piano, there's a projection of different images from different movies of the Statue of Liberty being destroyed in different films. And then when you don't hit any keys, there's a dude dressed as the Statue of Liberty reciting the death speech from Blade Runner. You just sort of have to see it. It makes sense. But we went on from there and we did a thing called the Private Drive-In, which is we built this out of an old VW Bug. You sit inside the car and there's like images of a drive-in projected onto the gallery wall, and you're sitting inside the car and people are sort of almost making out, but when you hold the horn down, the seats vibrate and people start making out, and there's music that's like quadraphonic, and it's kind of, every piece has a musical element to it, but they're ultimately all art installations. And at first we just did them for fun. It kind of, for me as an artist, it sort of replaced the need to go on stage for some reason. Like it scratched the same itch, if that makes sense. And it's me and my wife and another guy called Kenny Heitmuller. It's kind of the three of us go and build these things together. And that was the first couple. And then we, because of our relationships with brands and stuff, we found ourselves building stuff for brands, which is awesome. So we did like this thing called the Jose Cuerva cell, which is this giant sort of carousel made out of bottles with a shop vac blowing air over the bottles, and the whole thing spins around and plays Auld Lang Syne. It was when we made the commercial for them for New Year's, and we built this giant thing for Siemens, which is like a organ that plays different images of wind energy being collected. Yeah, so it sort of turned into its own little corner of the company, and we have a facility that's big enough to build stuff like that. So yeah.
That is wild. That is not at all what I was expecting.
No, I know.
Like,
I mean, we when you walk into Foy's now, like the most recent piece we made is a giant, it's like 10 kiosks, kind of look like large weighing machines. They have screens on each of them, and when you stand on one of them, it plays a little bit of like there's like all this jungle footage that's kind of cut together, and it'll play like the bass part, and then if someone stands on the one next to it, it plays like the drums, and if all 7 of them are if you're standing on all of them, it plays this sort of Afrobeat tune that we composed. So yeah, there's just like weird stuff in our studio.
I love it. It really makes me wish like everything was opened up, because
We used to have great parties. You know, the last thing, I think it was, end of February. It was like the last time. I was like worried that people might have got sick at our last party because nobody knew anything about that at that point. Well, they did, they were just ignoring it. But nobody did, so it was fine. But yeah, we have good parties at our place. So you'll get an invite to the next one.
Oh, good. All right. Well, let me know when and I'll book my tickets.
Definitely.
All right, so this, we've kind of been going through almost your history and taking all these tangents. So now we get to today, or a couple months ago, with Bliss comes out. I think that was the third film that you scored for Mike Ko.
That's right. Yeah.
And I've got to say, I thought it was like a more kind of just sci-fi film.
Mm-hmm.
And so watching it, I was totally unprepared for kind of all of the different genre mashes and kind of pseudo genres thrown in.
Right.
And yeah, it is kind of a
very
hard
layered
film to pigeonhole. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think because of that, because there's like there's a romance drama element, a sci-fi element. There's like kind of even like crime aspects overlaid throughout. There's just so much that's going on. How did you sit down and figure out what sound that film's gonna have?
God, This one was, so it's funny, me and Mike have we've done 3 movies together now, but there was 7 years between I Origins and Bliss, and in that time we did 4 TV shows together. So that's kind of that other little thing that we've been up to. You know, he he gave me my first TV show. Actually, I have a lot to thank Mike for. He did the pilot for a show called The Magicians that ended up running for 5 seasons, and then we did The Path, and then we did Rise, and we did another show called Night Flyers. So in that time, in that 7 years, we've done tons of work together, and we've developed a real trust and shorthand with one another. And one of the things with Mike is that he loves to get music in there early. And I think maybe we were doing Night Flyers, so it would have been like 2018, maybe even 17, and he gave me the script for Bliss. So Bliss has been kind of like kicking around for years, literally. And I think when I read it, we spoke like the next day, and we started talking about music then, you know, like ridiculously early, like 2 years before the shoot. But generally, like that's one of the lovely things with him, is that we'll have a conversation, and then I'll write some sketches, and then maybe he'll be on set, and by the time he's on set, we've even got a couple of themes going on. And I remember him telling me that he was driving to the first day of shooting on The Path, and he didn't know the cast very well at that point, and they're all in the van together, and he was like, right, everyone shut up, listen to this. And he like played my sketch that ended up becoming the main titles for the show, and they were kind of like driving to war, you know, driving to their first day of shooting. I love that. It's so lovely and rare for a composer to be kind of involved in that process, and he'll send me, you know, dailies, and I've got access, and I can see everything that they're doing. And that was very much the case with Bliss, that we started talking about tone super early. And, you know, back then, I think right at the beginning, he was imagining it being more almost absurdist, if that makes sense. Like really wild shit, like crazy horns, like really, we talked a lot about a movie called Underground. Do you know that film? It's from the former Yugoslavia. It's about these people that they live underground during the Second World War, I think it is, and they come back up, and they don't realize that like 30 years has gone by, and there's another war, and it's the Yugoslavian war. And that it's kind of like a lot of sort of crazy instrumentation and wild like Romanian party music is what we talked about. But you know, as time goes on, and when they actually started to shoot, it seemed to make more sense that it needed to be more emotional and kind of reined in, I guess. And so by the time he was editing, I think we already had, I think maybe I'd done 10 or 15 sketches, and we'd already kind of zeroed in on melody and theme and that kind of stuff. So really that it sort of made more sense that melody was going to be a big tool, more so than some of the other projects that we've done together, where we use melody to sort of change context, you know, like that will be the thread, that will be the thing that kind of connects you to these characters. And although they're in all these different scenarios, changing the instrumentation of this melody will be the thing that kind of unites it, and show you the different worlds. So that was a relatively late decision to do that. But I mean, I say that, but I think then we still were in post for probably another year because of COVID. But yeah, it was a very long process, this one. He finished shooting in 2019, I guess. And then we were kind of in post, and then I squeezed in an orchestral session in January of 2020. And Mike attended. It was in New York City. It's actually the first time that I've ever worked with an orchestra, which is nuts. Like after all these years, I've managed to get away with not doing it. I've always, when I'm using strings, it always tends to be like quintets, quartets, small crews, soloists. It's also just by the nature of the kinds of projects that I've been on, you know, it just makes sense sometimes to just, you know, I'll record my guy in New York like 5 times with 5 different violins and then move the mic around, and then there we go, that sounds like an orchestra. That's sort of how we've been doing it. And it was so lovely for me to finally call up a lot of these collaborators and be like, all right, we're going to do it together this time. We're going to be in a room. And I called up the cellist from Another Earth and I Origins, who's now the musical director of the Orlando Philharmonic, and he decided he was going to be the conductor, and it was great. So we were able to kind of squeeze that in just before lockdown happened, and then it like derailed the entire Amazon release plan, which in the end I think was probably fine, because Mike lives in Croatia now, and he took the edit back to Croatia and just kind of tinkered with the cut for 6 months, and I carried on kind of tinkering with my score, and then here we are. But yeah, finding the tone of that movie was really, really hard, really difficult. It was, as you said, it's like layered and complicated, and melody was the key to unlocking it, I think.
Interesting. And because I think I don't remember when the film came out, but I think the score released sometime in early February, because
we were like
I listened to it as of recording right now. I listened to it about a month and a half ago, probably maybe the day it came out, or that weekend or something. And my first listen, because it's just jumping around genre so much,
right?
That like it's a bit more of a kind of romantic, not quite elegant. But I think you know what I'm saying, like near the opening cues, and then it gets into a more of headier sci-fi feeling, and then later on with the thought visualizer and the Hotel Pleiades, it's like a much more almost like loungy, jazzy sound. And I'm listening to this in like the course of under an hour. I'm like, how does all this work?
Right.
And so I listened to it once or twice. Yeah, and then I saw it in context, and then I listened to it again earlier, and I was like, oh, you know what? Now it feels like there's much more of a like connecting line throughout everything, and obviously like being able to kind of visualize as things go. But yeah, it was a really strange first experience with the score.
Good. I like that. I like strange. Sometimes with I love soundtrack albums, and like I said, that was like that was the first record I bought, and I still kind of love buying and listening to soundtrack albums. But I sometimes just wish that they took you on a journey a little bit more, and rather than kind of being that sort of background thing, I tend to try and make them almost deliberately U-turny, just to kind of have it not be the background dinner jazz thing that maybe some scores end up being. But that this particular score is so all over the place, and that because of the fact that there are these 2 defined worlds, and one of them, almost the purpose of it is to fill you with this feeling of chaos, and the feeling that Greg is going through, where he's just like, is this real? What's going on? And like, I think Mike's intention is always to make the viewer decide which is real, and give validity to both worlds as much as possible. And that was a really clear mandate. And one of the things with the ugly world, as he likes to call it, is to just kind of give it this kind of visceral energy, this sort of unexpected jolt. And one of the ways that I wanted to do that was with live performance. And of course there's the orchestra, but I also wanted there to be like this sort of wildness to it, like a kind of really crazy, frenetic energy that comes from the drums in the end. There's a wonderful drummer called Spencer Cohen, who's featured on a lot of those cues, and he's a jazz drummer, but he's kind of doing really bonkers shit all the way through it. And it's also a little insight into where the score was right at the beginning of the process. Like I said, it was kind of really, really wild at one point, and then we sort of took a sledgehammer to a lot of the cues in the same way that Mike took a sledgehammer to the edit, and like just carried on kind of changing the order of things. But that initial idea of like wild virtuosity, I think is still in there. I was really important to me to like really have this like crazy feeling.
And that makes a lot more sense now as to, like you just said, where that the initial
Mm.
thought process was with the, what this the sound could potentially be, because wanted to create a chaotic, crazy world, like, yeah, that stylistically really makes a lot of sense. And
Yeah, and it's still about the journey, you know. It
mhm,
should be, like I said, I want it to feel like the rabbit hole, you know, like come on this, like where are we going next? What's happening now? This is crazy. But, oh, now I get it. You know, that kind of feeling. Um, that's that's where I wanted it to live.
I appreciate that, and it's actually interesting. I was having a conversation online with a few people about kind of the, like, how soundtrack release albums, like, not necessarily should be, but how different fans want them to be. And
Mhm.
obviously, like, as anyone other than the composer, like, we don't have a say into what you should be doing with your release. But it's interesting where some people's view is just like, I want every single cue in chronological order, even if it's 10 seconds long. Like, just throw everything in there because I want all of it. And then
Right.
others, and I think I'd fall more into this bucket, like, find it much more interesting to have something that's more curated and that takes you on its own journey. And maybe it's one that mirrors the film, or one that, you know, differs slightly just based on how it is musically. So yeah, after digesting the score for a while, and especially in the context of the film, like, it definitely takes you on a journey like that, and one that, like you said, it's just this labyrinthine rabbit hole, and you have no idea where you're going or how you're going to get there until you land at the end.
Right. Yeah. And I hope that there are still beats where you connect, you know, like you're
Hmm.
connecting with them and their character. But, you know, I think that I try to mirror as much, at least at first, I try to be chronological, and then inevitably it always ends up taking a departure. Um, and you know, it's funny, like talking of Mike, like the first For Another Earth, like um, that one in the end was more like a remix album. And then I Origins was more kind of conventional. And then I feel like this one is somewhere in the middle where you don't always want the cues to appear exactly as they appear in the movie. It just kind of sometimes doesn't make sense musically, or there's like an opportunity to embellish something that you didn't get the opportunity to do. There's a couple of cues even on the album that aren't actually in the movie, for example. Um, it's like, oh, I can use that thing that we were going to use, but the scene got cut. So, you know, that's always been, it's such a lovely process for a composer to have that experience at the end, as long as there's time, because these things tend to get very rushed and just sort of shoehorned in at the last minute. Fortunately with this one, there was a bit of time to give it some thought, and like it's a nice way to sort of kiss goodbye to the process, you know, like it's a nice sorbet at the end of it all. So yeah, it's cool.
Yeah, that is really cool. And it's, and I guess accidentally, but this is like the opposite scenario that I've, compared to what I hear from basically every other composer and every other project, where you had a lot of time, at least maybe on the back end of things.
Hmm.
But did you ever view that having that much time, having 6 months to kind of tinker with things, would actually, like, could potentially be detrimental?
Maybe, but I don't think it was ever really. It was always just around the corner. You know, it's very
Mm,
COVID like. You know what I mean? Like we were never told you're going to be locked down for a year. We were told like,
yeah, that's
yeah, in a
true.
couple of weeks you're going to be out of this, and that was kind of what was happening with this as well. So tinkering is maybe not the best term. It was more like that scene's not working. Let's do something to fix it. Okay, and then the mix is now going to be on this day. Actually, now it's been pushed again. Let's fix that scene. You know, it was kind of like these sort of constant little tasks that Mike and I were assigning ourselves, and it was really like just the two of us. They kind of just led us to it, which is interesting. And you know, the other thing that was really great that came entirely because of COVID was the song that's the first track on that album. That started off as this idea where he wanted there to be this epilogue, and in actual fact the epilogue is the real reason things kind of got massively delayed, because Amazon were like, do you want to do anything else? And he was like, yeah, I want to shoot an epilogue. And they're like, okay, great, shoot it. And that was in February. And then they're like,
Wow.
stop, you can't do it now, you got to wait. So we waited and we waited. Meanwhile, we're doing other things, and then eventually he shot it in August. So when we were talking about the epilogue, he's like, well, why don't we do a kind of an a cappella vocal version of the love theme? And I was like, that's great. I got this dear friend in London called Sky Edwards from Mochiba. I'd love to work with her again. So I called her up and asked if she would just sing that thing. And then Mike heard it. It's like, that's great. Why don't we do a song that kind of goes into the end titles? And so I wrote some words knowing that she would sing it. And then he heard that and was like, this is great. Let's put that in the roller skating cue. And I can't remember what the song was in the edit, but they got rid of that song, and he recut the whole scene with my song in it. And then it was too short, so I had to write another verse, and then the guy sang that. But it was kind of like this very natural, organic, like, we're not in a hurry, let's experiment with this thing. And it was just, again, you know, an excuse for me to work with an old mate, which is awesome. She's so good. She's such a badass. I just adore Sky. And it was, yeah, I think the song came out great. And then, you know, they wanted to make a music video out of it, which is fun. So she did that with us.
And then at some point you had the chance to do like a remix or different version that's
Yeah,
the Foy's version.
That's right, the Foy's version. Yeah,
Yeah.
which, again, I haven't done something. It's like the first remix I've done in ages. It's like, whoa, I'll just remix my own song. Why not? Yeah, that was like a spur of the moment decision, just for the record, just for fun. But yeah, I think it was a nice way as well. You know, the song is kind of based on the love theme. It's melodically got some of the same DNA. So, you know, it was helpful for there to be another thing that unifies things a bit more, just to stop it from being quite so tangential. So, yeah.
No, that's I don't know, that's really cool. It is a nice hearing when, you know, whether by, you know, voluntary and involuntarily, like there's actually more time to work on things, and yeah, not necessarily tinker like you said, but to actually just spend more time on it.
Yeah.
And yeah, the results definitely show. I think it's a song that, because quite often when you hear a vocal track on especially like on a soundtrack release, quite often it's really jarring. Like it'll be a pop single that's related to it, maybe,
Right.
but then
Yeah.
it feels like it has nothing to do with the rest of the score. And yet and frankly, when I first put the album on, that's kind of what I was expecting. So it was quite a relief to actually be like, oh no, this fits with everything else. Like it actually makes sense to be here.
Right on. That's great. Yeah, and I think that Mike had that. He just always struggled with that scene, I think,
Mm.
for that exact reason. Like every time the song, no matter what song he tried, it was just like, oh, now it's kind of working. But at first you're just like, ooh, it's just a little butt clenchy or something. But for some reason, as soon as it was never intended to be the song for that scene, but he did it, and he recut a few things, and suddenly it just landed for him in a better way than it ever had. So we kept it. But yeah, you know, it's, again, like having this amount of time, like he and I, we've done, now it's kind of across the gambit. We've had tons of time. We've had zero time, you know, like normally with television, he and I try to sort of engineer the situation so that we can have that kind of collaborative moment. But in TV, honestly, it's like 4 days. Like he'll get 4 days in the edit after he's done shooting to do the director's cut, and then he's off. So, you know, that's why I'm normally writing while he's shooting, just so that we have that back and forth moment. And with Bliss, it was just the other extreme. It was so great to be able to have these like lovely long conversations, and, you know, these sort of theoreticized discussions about theme and structure and instrumentation, and, you know, it was really great, really fun.
I love that, and especially with how, and not everyone realizes, but how collaborative the process is between a composer and a director to actually make sure that everyone's on the same page and that everything is really married so that it all fits. Having
Totally.
that extra time, I mean, it's crucial. So it's great that not only did you have like, not just 8 weeks or 10 weeks, which would be a while in film, but way, way,
Yeah.
way longer.
Accidentally,
Yeah.
months, months. Yeah, no, it's great.
But Will, we're right near an hour. Um, Before I let you go, I did want to ask if you have anything else that you're working on now that we can kind of expect in the next couple months or the next, year. Hopefully, this
Yeah.
is actually the end of everything, but we will see.
So there's a movie called Edge of the World, which was another thing that I was working on during lockdown. Again, it kind of started, I was in there right at the beginning. I think it was, gosh, I think I started working on that one in November of 2019. But it's my first period movie starring Jonathan Rhys-Meyers as Raja James Brooke, who went to Borneo in the 19th century and accidentally became the Raja of Sarawak, and then his nephew ended up leading the nation until the Second World War. It's a really fascinating story. It was kind of the story that then led to James Conrad and Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now and stuff. It's very kind of about that experience of the Kurtz kind of leader. But yeah, that one is coming out, I think, in the US. I think it's coming out June 4th. Really different score, very I ended up learning to play an instrument called the sarpe, which is a sort of a Sarawak lute. There's a guy out there who built one for me and sent it out here, and I found another one on Etsy actually. I feel like I've sort of made a career out of picking up instruments and figuring out how to kind of get something out of it. So that was an experience, and then using some fantastic musicians on that one. So that's a super fun project. And then I have a video game that I'm just finishing up now, which is only my second video game. I did a Rainbow Six game a couple years ago, and this is also with Ubisoft, different franchise. But yeah, that's fun. I'm not a gamer at all, but it's been insightful to get into that world a bit more. Yeah, lots of fun things on the horizon. So
Very cool.
yeah.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to those. I used to be a big gamer, not really anymore, but I don't know. One of these days, I want to actually like learn about video game music because it seems in my head it seems like so different than film music because obviously film is a
Linear
set linear
thing.
narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. That was always like the part of it that I was most nervous about. Like, oh, does everything have to loop? And how do I, but honestly, like Ubisoft are amazing. Their music department is just fantastic, and they're super smart and really brilliant at kind of taking cues and sort of figuring out what stems would go where and creating, I just kind of score it like it's a movie, and then they just there's just a lot of music. It's like an hour of music.
Wow.
And you do have to have that understanding that they're probably going to take elements from other cues and make sure that they work together. So yeah, but yeah, it's fun. It's a fun process.
Very cool. So we'll keep our eyes and ears open for those to release.
Right on. Well, thank you
Well,
for having me.
yeah, of course, and I'm so glad you're able to join me.
It's been a pleasure. It's great to chat.
Yeah. So yeah, you have a great rest of your weekend, and I'll be looking forward to the Fall on Your Sword party
Yeah,
invites.
there you go. You'll get your invite as soon as you've had your vaccine. All right, take care. Thanks so
You
much.
too.